Hi, everybody, and welcome to Connect Safely Live. I'm Larry Magid, and my co-host is Carrie Gallagher. Carrie, how you doing?
Hi, Larry. So good to see you again.
Good to see you, and it's also really good to see Irina Raicu, who's I'm looking over at her bio. I'm going to forget her bio. She runs the Marcola Center for Internet Ethics at Santa Clara University, and I've gotten to know her over the last several years because they have an advisory board of people from throughout Silicon Valley, and we meet and have very high-level, heady conversations. And we're going to have one of those today. So, Irina, welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to edit that just a little bit. I run the Internet Ethics program at the Marcola Center for Applied Ethics. So I don't run the whole center.
Right, she runs the Internet Ethics program, but she could run the whole center because she runs things very nicely. Very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and it's really great to have you. There are so many questions. I mean, ethics are such an important part of all of our discussions about technology, about life in general. And now we are in a situation where we really have to think about sort of the cost-benefit analysis of some of the things that we're doing as a society during this emergency. All morning, I've been on the radio talking about this new technology that Apple and Google are developing. It's the API, the application interface, the underlying technology that will let app developers create tracing apps that will be issued, I believe, through public health authorities. So now we have Apple and Google having technology which allows government agencies to trace people. Now, there are a gazillion privacy tools that have been put in place. I don't want to make anybody assume that they are necessarily going to be able to personally identify people, but nevertheless, privacy experts and advocates worry about any form of tracking, tracing, profiling, even if it's said to be anonymous. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think it's a really difficult and nuanced topic. And a part of it is just that the technical details are still unclear. My understanding is, based on what I've read, that they would say they are not really allowing governments to trace people.
Not directly, right.
And that this is sort of that they are creating a foundation on which other trusted third parties will be able to build apps that do different things, but that the foundation itself is as privacy protective as possible. Now, Google and Apple are very powerful, but they're not the only group that's creating APIs like that. And there are other consortia of academics, and there are other governments working on this. And I think it's fascinating for me that the discussion has gone so quickly to privacy, and I can understand why, and I consider myself a privacy advocate. But I think we have a more foundational issue at play here, which is that we're not at all sure whether these apps will actually work as intended.
Right.
And if they don't, to even have the sort of trade-off discussion around privacy is unnecessary and problematic. Because as you said, the cost-benefit analysis really has to start with, does this work?
Right.
And there are fascinating reasons why it might not work. One of them is simply that not everybody has these kind of cell phones or other means of implementing this kind of tracing. So we're not even talking about whether contact tracing is necessary and good, because it is in a pandemic. But we used to do it with humans. And now we're trying to figure out whether technology can replace those humans or help them, right? So the first part is to recognize that if you have an app, but a bunch of people in a society don't have access to that app, you risk missing entire populations and entire areas that might be infected, right? Another major issue here is that of trust, because even among the people who do have phones and could download the app, there's a real question whether enough of them would, as long as it's opt-in, right? And we know that about 60% of the population would need to use this app for it to be effective. And it's fascinating to see how in different parts of the world, there's trust in different kind of entities. So it seems to me like in Germany and in Australia, the citizens are willing to accept a more centralized version of these kind of apps that does give more information to the government. And they're more worried about Google and Apple. While in other parts of the world, people definitely don't trust their governments, and they would rather have Google and Apple kind of build this and at least, have faith that this is built well and it would work effectively. And it really remains to be seen whether enough people will download the apps once we have them.
And in addition to the human elements, I worry about the technology as well, because Bluetooth is not perfect. And will it measure proximity properly? Would we get false negatives? Maybe somebody's 8 feet away and is not a risk. Maybe they're wearing an N95 mask. And I don't know if the apps are going to be able to make those determinations. I did read yesterday that Google and Apple are building proximity and duration into the recording, so that will help. But again, I worry about both the human and the technical sides. I see that Carrie has a follow-up question as well.
I do. I really like what you were talking about when you were talking about access, Irina, and the ethical concerns about access to the technology. That connects really closely to something that the conversation we're having in education right now, right? So
Absolutely.
In many states around the country, students will not be returning to the physical campus and will continue with remote learning. And I think at first, as with many issues of inequity, the issues of inequity within the education system have been exposed as a result of these circumstances. What are some things that, as a society, the United States, we've decided that it's our obligation to educate our children, and that's why public education is provided for free, no matter where you are, where you live, who you are, how much money you make, what religion you subscribe to, any of that. But there are children who are most certainly not able to access an education right now. So what are the ethical constructs, and who is obligated to do something about this, and who should be stepping up to take action here?
Yeah, well, I think it's fascinating, by the way, and it's also, it shows us also how the advances have really helped us, right? Because a few years ago, we wouldn't have had the technology to even enable the kind of, classroom experience that we're seeing now. So we wouldn't be having this conversation. Everybody would be sort of left out. And now we have this partial access. I definitely think the federal government has a role to play. And I know there are several FCC commissioners who feel like the FCC should be doing much more to promote widespread access, especially in rural areas. But really in every community, there is this kind of inequality, including in Silicon Valley. We know that. And people who just don't have access, especially to broadband internet. I think it's also important that the educators themselves realize this, and my experience is that they do. I think all the teachers and instructors I've talked to are very concerned about this issue and trying to figure out what to do about it. I don't know if you guys saw this story, but it's fascinating. Apparently some districts were placing school buses as Wi-Fi hotspots in certain neighborhood to enable the connectivity that we're talking about. So I think it's fascinating to see how, this problem is causing some creativity around issues that, again, have been with us for a long time. It's just that, like you said, now this really exposes them.
Interestingly enough, the private sector actually is coming to some response to this. I know that some of the internet service providers, including Comcast, are offering free internet for a period of time to people who qualify for school lunches, who can show that they're low income. So if you know anybody who's in this situation, they should reach out to their internet service provider to see if there's a free or a very low cost program that they can get into.
And various companies have also donated, various kinds of computers and iPads and things like that. So I think a lot of different groups are trying. But I think this has to be a lift at the governmental level. Yeah.
I have just a sort of follow-up question to this. Once we move past this stage, right, of we are pretty much still shut down, the reopenings are very small pockets, right? What will be our ethical obligations to our students as we start to reopen in terms of not just their own health and safety, but how they feel about being safe and how they feel about being at school? Should schools be making being in the physical building optional for a little while? What does that look like so that we can ensure that they're gaining access to their education, but they're able to do it in a way that is providing them with some safety as well?
I would actually love to hear what you think about that. You are the educator in the trenches, so it sounds like you've been thinking about how you would go back.
Yeah. I mean, I think we don't have any answers, but I think we are, as educators, really interested in the ethics of, number one, our obligation to provide the education, but number two, you know, the obligation to make sure that they're first and foremost, the children are safe, right, and are well. And so balancing those is interesting. And you know, this may lead really closely into the conversation that we kind of started to happen off air before we started broadcasting, is maybe we don't have enough information to know what those obligations are yet, right? So I think you and Larry were talking about the obligation of the media to share how much they don't know, right? And I don't know, Larry, maybe you want to pose that question.
Well, I mean, there's so much information and misinformation, and there's probably something in between there, just confused information. Just yesterday, Elon Musk tweeted that that we're all under house arrest. And in a way, I think he's full of crap, but another way, it's actually true. I mean, I don't have the freedom. I can go for a walk in my neighborhood, but there are places that I'm not allowed to go. My children, if I had young children, couldn't play on the play structure in the public park. So the government has basically told us that we have certain things we can't do, but it's all happening during a time when some people are claiming that there's really very little danger. I mean, if you watch certain cable news networks, you're going to get the impression that the death rate is way exaggerated and the risk to most people is very low. And okay, you might get what's the equivalent of a cold. And then you listen to other people, you think that this is horribly dangerous. And the fact is that even the experts don't know. And so in an abundance of caution, some of us are taking extreme measures. I haven't had any kind of physical contact with anybody except for my wife now for 6 weeks. And other people are going about their lives pretty much as normal, going to parties and hanging out with friends and not worrying about social distancing. And we don't know for sure which is right.
Well, and let's unpack some of that. I think when Elon Musk says that we're under house arrest, he must never have been under house arrest, because everything you just described means we're not. And there have always been restrictions, right? You know, we never could just cross a border willy-nilly without going through checks. We never, I mean, the reality is we do make certain trade-offs with our freedom in order to be part of a social group, right? And in this case, we're living through, again, these really unprecedented times. We keep hearing from medical professionals that this is not similar to anything, that this is a real struggle. And somehow we keep not taking their word for it. They're the ones who, I think, know better whether this is like other things we've encountered or not. And so I think what Elon Musk did was not just sort of provide information, but put out a kind of exaggeration of something that we are indeed all struggling with, right? And my concern with that is that, you know, I think it's so interesting. There's a researcher at the University of Washington named Kate Starbird, and she has been studying the spread of disinformation and misinformation online for years now, you know, intentional and unintentional. And she had a really thoughtful piece, I think, just a couple of days ago about this, in which she said that at a time like this of so much uncertainty, all of us are sharing information, some of which is not accurate or some of which changes. And I've been sort of critical and sort of telling everybody, share less, unless you really know that it's true, just share less. She drew a really interesting and I think a kind distinction between most of us kind of sharing information because we're trying to make sense of this ever-changing world with our friends, let's say on social media, and influencers. And Elon Musk is an influencer. And when they share this kind of information, it has a very different effect. So who does it is part of this equation. And when influencers share it, it's taken as having a weight to it and a truth to it that is not given to some of the rest of us users. And so they really have a responsibility to be careful and to check and not to exaggerate. Yeah. And I think sometimes we give sort of this weight to statements of people who are experts or very good at something, but really know nothing about another area and sort of feel free to comment in an area that they're not experts in.
And of course, Elon Musk is wanting to open up his Tesla factory in Fremont and is not being allowed to, so he has a vested interest. But if you watch, for example, some of the television commentators, I'll be very specific, Fox News, I was watching Laura Ingraham last night, and if I were to listen to her and interpret what she's saying, I would probably feel free to go hang out with people because she kind of give me the impression that this thing is not as dangerous as public health officials are saying it is. And I don't think that Dr. Fauci has a political agenda. I know for a fact that the health officials that I know personally don't have a political agenda, but it's become politicized. We've got essentially the left saying it's dangerous and the right saying, yeah, maybe not so dangerous. And then the president giving us completely mixed messages.
Yeah, and this is a problem because, of course, if you do take the precautionary measures like California did, then it makes it look like it's less dangerous because those are actually working. And then people say, oh, well, then you were exaggerating in your response, right? But that's the point, that we've seen, by now various places which didn't put in place the kind of, strict measures that we have here. And that spike really did happen. So it's interesting with all these models that some people will quote and say, well, they were not accurate. The models reflect potential futures. And if we respond a certain way, they won't be accurate. And we want those models not to be accurate because we've taken actions that prevent the worst possible scenario from happening. So I think it's really how you understand the kind of dynamic that you're in.
There's a known phenomenon in medicine where somebody is given a prescription and they take the prescription and they feel better. So because they feel better, they stop taking the medicine. And for a while, they're going to continue to feel better, but there's a good chance that they're going to get very sick again. And it's the fact that the medicine is working, which makes them feel that they don't need it, but they do need it.
And I think, that's an interesting comparison because medicines too have sometimes very unpleasant side effects. And we're seeing side effects of the precautionary measures that have been taken, and people are definitely hurt by them. But the question is, what is the better, how do you balance the benefits and the harms?
Right.
So this conversation has led me to think about, we're all, sort of abiding by the government's recommendations and the recommendations of the doctors who are on the advisory team to stay at home and to only go out for necessities and exercise. And when we do go out for exercise, make sure we're in a place that's not crowded or wear a mask and all of that. But we're doing that, I think, out of a feeling of moral obligation, not because there are sort of police arresting people who don't at this point. So I wonder if you have a sense of, in your study of ethics, are people doing it, do you think, based on fear? Are they doing it based on hope for improvement? Is it a mix of those things? And how long can we expect, mere humans to be willing to make these really drastic sacrifices just out of a, ethical or moral feeling that they have?
I think people have responded very much from compassion and from wanting to be helpful to their community. That's, my sense here too. I think the fear is of the virus, not of, being arrested. So I think there's also kind of a self-protective aspect to all of this. It's not all altruism. But I think you're absolutely right that as time goes, and people are really stressed by this kind of weird living situation we're in, that everybody's starting to push the boundaries a little bit and, try to see how that would work. And that governments themselves are trying to figure out that they know that people are, in a weird psychological place, and they're trying to figure out what adjustments could be made to accommodate for that. But I also want to be careful of something, because you said, and I think a lot of us say, we all do this. And I think we have to be really mindful of the people who all along have not had a chance to stay home and, connect via the internet. We've had, at the Markkula Center, we had an event yesterday about the ethics of returning to work. And part of it, and part of what some of us have been writing about it, is about the ethics of remaining at work. That in talking about returning to work, we really need to remember all of the people who, were out in the fields collecting food for us, and were in the hospitals, and were, in the stores. They didn't get to walk around the neighborhood with their family as much. They're worried about bringing the infection into their family, so they might actually be seeing their family members less. And we just have to be really careful that we don't generalize. And I think with a lot of the technological solutions, we have a tendency to do that. Again, I don't know how many times I've heard people say, we all carry these phones around. Well, no, we don't.
No. Well, it's interesting because, I always, watching television, I'll hear a commentator say, we all are suffering. We all want to get back to work. But the fact is that the television commentators are working. As far as I know, the three of us are all working and getting paid for our prospective jobs. Most people who are talking publicly are in fact still employed. But you have these millions of people. Even just today, there was, I think, 3.8 million more new claims, unemployment claims, on top of all of the ones that we've already gotten. And then, as you mentioned, you have people who are working, and I'm thinking about these people working in the meat processing plants, who are really at very high risk. The government is basically going to say these plants must stay open if the president's order goes through, in which case workers are going to be pressured to work. They're not obligated to work, but the amount of stress that these people must be going through, having to decide, do I risk my family and my own health, or do I risk poverty and not being able to, buy food, to put food on the table? That must be an agonizing decision for some people.
Yeah, but I also think that we're forgetting that there's a third option, which is we could actually be protecting these people properly and making sure that they have enough personal protection, right? That doesn't seem to be part of the conversation. It's either do you force them to go to work or do you allow them not to? And then we somehow accept the working conditions that they have, which are completely unacceptable and which led to the kind of, spike in infections. And we keep hearing from these various groups who are supposed to be essential workers that they're not being protected enough.
And the meatpacking plants are claiming that they're providing protection, but we'll have to see if they actually do. The unions are debating that question.
And the rules had been changed, as far as I know, just in April. The rules were changed to allow for even more, chickens to be processed, within a certain amount of time. I mean, the rules are being loosened. At the same time that we need, I don't know how you do social distancing in a chicken processing plant, but that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, right?
As you're talking about the rules changing, it's making me think about the fact that the information that we're being told about what is true about the virus and what may or may not happen in likelihood, that's constantly changing too. So, I think as participants in our society who are trying to do what we can to take care of one another, take care of ourselves, that the amount of information is overwhelming, right? So what is it that we can do to make sure that we're upholding our ethical obligation to stay informed under these circumstances, so that we can care for each other and ourselves, but not overwhelm ourselves with information, or say, oh, because they recommended this last week and this is a new recommendation this week, they were lying, right? Because I don't know that that's the case, right? This information is constantly changing right now.
Yeah, I will say for me, that's sort of the scariest aspect of it, is that you realize that everybody's struggling to understand what's going on. The doctors, the people who are responding in hospitals, even the modes of treatment are changing based on what people see is working or not working. It's this time of great uncertainty. And I think that's a really interesting question, like, what are the ethics of staying informed? How do you properly stay informed? Because you want to do the right thing. And I continue to trust the public health experts. And I completely understand that they are struggling with this unprecedented virus that they don't understand. So I will totally change my behavior based on their changing recommendations, realizing that they're learning as they go. But I also think that all of us somehow got into this mode where we're kind of acting like journalists on social media. I keep reminding people that until a few years ago, Facebook is where you went and posted pictures of your kids and your dog and recipes, and you were not sharing news links on Facebook until Mark Zuckerberg decided that you need to turn Facebook into your own personalized newspaper, which I think is a terrible idea. And now you get all these links coming at you from your friends with the added sort of trust that comes from being shared by your friends, which might be totally wrong. So that's a part where I feel like we could all step back a little bit and let the journalists do their job. They're much better at vetting things than we are as individuals, and maybe sort of take in our own diet of information from sources that we believe are trusted sources, but don't necessarily try to turn ourselves into the next layer of a trusted source.
Well, Irina, as a journalist, I appreciate your vote of confidence, but unfortunately, not all your fellow Americans would agree with you. And
I know
the president has been saying for years now that mainstream media calls it lamestream media, And apparently millions of our fellow Americans don't believe the journalists are telling the truth. So how do we, if we can't agree on basic facts, how can we have a conversation?
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge. And I think, you know, the fact that a lot of people feel that they can get their truth from, you know, social media rather than from the mainstream media this is a real problem, and I'm not sure how to address that. I also know that researchers have looked at this, and that the whole sort of subject of media literacy, which used to be what we would say will be the solution, right? You learn how to assess things. You need to become a more informed consumer of media. But that's been actually weaponized, as the researchers put it, because various people came out and said, you need to do your own research. Don't trust the media. Go and see, you know, what you find. Use your critical thinking, and then sending people to these completely inaccurate, misleading sources of information. So now there we are. I'm not saying there should be blind trust in the media by any means, but I'm not sure what would be a better, more trusted source.
Yeah, so it's interesting because as we're seeing people share information because they've become their own journalists, even though they're not the professionals and they don't have access to the information or the networks that journalists do, is there something that these social media platforms should be doing in order to reduce the exposure to misinformation of their users? Or is that censorship and they shouldn't? You know, where is that line?
I think they've been taking a much stronger stance in terms of the medical misinformation and trying to reduce the spread of that. I think they're trying to do interim things that don't involve actually taking down posts, but let's say flagging them as having been contested by fact checkers, or you know, linking to counterpoints about certain things. But medical misinformation is clearer to spot than other kinds, so they've been more willing to just take down posts that put out, especially when, you know, things about false treatments or things that could be dangerous to people's health. And I don't see that as censorship. I mean, I think censorship implies that you favor a particular point of view, and I think, you know, don't drink bleach is not, you know, a point of view that should be allowed to remain, right? Because of the implications for other people's health.
Well, okay, so the bleach one I think is fairly clear cut. I think it makes absolute no sense to allow people to advocate something that we know is harmful. But there's a lot of things we don't know. For example, I read a story the other day that the ingredient in Pepsid AC could be curative, but that we don't know that. We just know that somebody thought that. And so immediately there was a run on that. And now if you actually have heartburn and need that medication for your heartburn, you can't get it because people are stockpiling it because someone said that it may be helpful. Should that story have been taken down, or should it have been allowed to perpetuate?
Well, we know from what you said that it was not taken down.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those kinds of things, in fact, have been allowed to stay, and that's why we're seeing runs on various things. And I think that's the kind of situation where the companies are trying to respond with more accurate or different information, not by taking those posts down, but by creating kind of a context around them that says, this is not proven, you know, don't go out and hoard this.
Right.
But it's really tough. And like I said, I thought Kate Starbird's nuanced take was interesting, because she basically said it's a very human thing to just try to make sense and to feel like you have some control. And when you hear that something is working, you want to go and take part in it because you feel like it'll give you a little bit of control in this completely uncertain time. I think we're all being asked to live with a level of uncertainty and discomfort that we're just not used to.
Irina, we have a question from the audience that I wanted to share with you. It's from Ahmed Amr, and he's asking, isn't it true that both sides are politicizing the conversations about COVID-19 and what behaviors we should and shouldn't be engaging in order to either work or not work and stay safe at home? And he's asking, should these meat plant workers should we be referring to them as victims? Because they're kind of victims of the politicized conversation. Like, it's, as you mentioned, it's it's either they go to work and endanger themselves, or they don't go to work and they don't have income. And isn't that a politicized conversation that isn't taking into account that we could actually have them protected? Should we be referring to those people as victims because they're victims of the unethical conversation that's happening? I wonder what your thoughts are on his comment.
I think that some people would say that if you refer to them as victims, you're politicizing that decision that was just made. Right? Very
exactly.
powerful
yes.
word, and I completely understand why Ahmed would be saying that they are. I think there's just no getting away from politics, given the environment that we're in, and the kind of tensions that we've been living with for years. Everything is being seen through political lenses, and unfortunately, you would think that this kind of situation might sort of make us rise above that. And, you know, the one thing that we all seem to agree on is that the essential workers are heroes and wonderful, and we should be really grateful to them. I think both sides are sending out that message. But beyond that, every measure that's put out is being treated. I mean, you know, it started with the president saying that the whole discussion of this was a Democrat hoax, right? So it's been politicized, the whole discussion from the very beginning. And of course, you know, others feel that no matter what the president does, the media will never present it as being good. So yes, it's a politicized discussion, but I think it's just like everything else around us these days.
I want to pivot, we're almost out of time, but I want to pivot to another conversation. Earlier, you sent around, at least to myself and Carrie, a article by Dana Boyd, who's a very well-known social media researcher around teens. And she talks about screen time. And it's kind of ironic because I've known Dana since she started her career. And she was always an advocate of less paranoia by adults around kids having screen time. And now it seems like things are upside down in her mind. I wonder if you could sort of describe where she's coming from, what your thoughts are about it.
I don't think she sees it as things having changed. I think she sees this as confirmation of what she had said all along. She basically argued that the kids are not kind of consumed by the screens themselves, but that this is the one place left to them where they can really hang out with their friends and even potentially get away from their parents if they, you know, use different accounts that their parents are aware of, etc. And she's saying that the fact that teens now are forced onto screens all day long is driving them crazy, and that it confirms what she was saying, which is she says that teens are addicted to socialization, not to screens. And I think that's absolutely true. I keep thinking when we were teenagers, right, we probably spent hours on the phone talking to our friends. And I think most of us found ourselves, you know, deeply interesting and worthy of sharing with other people. And then you get a little older and you get a little more cautious about what you say and to whom, and you move away from all that sharing. So the fact is that I think any of us, if we had had these platforms when we were teenagers, we would have done just what the teenagers do now. And then at some point we would have grown out of it. And that we have to be really careful how we protect the kids, even younger than teens, and the teens who are using these platforms who might not understand some of the consequences. And we might actually want to change these tools so they will be more protective, and so things that kids say won't haunt them for the rest of their lives potentially. But I think she's basically saying, see, I told you all along that the point was not about the screens, but about kids just wanting to talk to each other.
And she made
I've seen articles, I don't know if you've seen these, Larry, but I've seen articles that say the screens have won. And I think that's very debatable.
Well, it's very debatable because I know a lot of people are talking about Zoom fatigue. And you mentioned young people and adults as well, getting to the point where they're just getting tired of looking at a screen all day. I know for me, it's becoming a little bit overwhelming. I mean, I'm glad I have access to it. And I'm glad that at least some young people are getting educated through their screens. But I can also understand why they would much rather be hanging out in the hallways with their friends. And by the way, when Dana started writing about this, one of the points she made, which I really resonated with me, was that one of the reasons why teenagers were attracted to screens is because we no longer allowed them to hang out at the mall or in other places because we were so afraid that they'd be abducted and abused and hurt or whatever. So we kind of put them in a bubble, and the screens were their ways of, to some extent, getting out of the bubble.
I wonder if these new nuances will help us to really identify which types of communication are best under which circumstances. Like one of the things that I've been trying to differentiate in during my workday is, when is it necessary for me to have a Zoom call where there's video, and when is it fine for me to just have a phone call or write an email, and not assuming that everything needs to rise to the level of a video call, right? It's necessary under certain circumstances and not under others. And so there shouldn't be an assumption that that's the way right now under, you know, to connect, and that's the only way and the best way. There's lots of ways we can connect with each other.
Absolutely. I think this broadly kind of makes us ask, what is the proper place and amount of technology in our lives, and what kind of technology? And to take it back to the discussion of contact tracing, I think that there are ways in which technology can be really useful in that effort. I just don't want to put, you know, all my trust in, you know, a particular app. And as long as people who design the tools understand and explain to everybody else their limitations and how they fit into a broader ecosystem, those are great tools. The problem is when we make assumptions about how they will work, how effective they will be, and then potentially don't pursue other means of getting information.
Right. And I have to say, when this whole thing started, I was really enjoying these Zoom calls because it was the closest thing I had to human interaction. And now I'm beginning to, I agree with Carrie, you know, pick up the phone, send an email, send a text, or just not say anything, because there is a limit as to how much socialization you need. And speaking of limits, we run across our own time limit, so I'm going to cut this off. But thank you so much, as usual, Carrie and Irina. We really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.